You're all very welcome to this, the second of our DCU Anti-Corruption Research Centre events on what we think is a pretty timely topic, which is the idea of corruption in the United States. We have a really excellent panel with us today. Joining us from Illinois State University, we have Professor Oz Dinser, who's an economist and director of the Institute for Corruption Studies. Oz has got a wide range of interests in corruption, ranging from how corruption shaped inequality and poverty outcomes in the States, to the links with economic freedom, to, is it causing some US states to diverge economically from others? So, and also it's Oz's birthday, so we're extra grateful for you taking the time to join us today, Oz. We also have, from closer to home, we have Dr. Tanya Lockhart, who's an assistant professor in digital media and society. She's also her faculty's associate dean for external engagement. Tanya's also involved in the very and appropriate fake news project, which I suspect will have something to say about some of our questions later on. And another piece of research of hers that caught my eye was on Russian disinformation campaigns in the US. So I'm sure, again, we'll have some occasion to draw on that expertise. And thanks for joining us, Tanya. And finally, Professor Gary Murphy, again from DCU. He's a professor of politics in our School of Law and Government. And he's the author, or a co-author, of the book on lobbying, which again is, everyone has one, but unfortunately there's not one for everyone in the audience. So thanks, Gary, for joining us.
Thanks, Rob.
The format for today is we're going to pose a few questions to our experts and let them battle it out over these ideas. And then towards the end, we'll have time for some questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please tap them into the chat. Michael on that, and we'll get through as many as we can towards the end of the session. So without further ado, I guess the obvious first question is, from your perspective in your respective academic disciplines and from your research background, and indeed Oz as someone who lives in the States, and Tanya, who's lived in other parts of the world where there's maybe legacy issues around corruption. Is the US a corrupt country, and how has it evolved over time? And we might put that to Oz first, as our resident American.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I've been studying corruption over the last 20 years, and I've been studying corruption in the US over the last 20 years as well. And, if you look at the used indices, World Bank or Transparency International, this is always, more corrupt than, say, Turkey, but less corrupt than Sweden, right? We all know that. But when it comes to measuring corruption at the national level in the United States, we really do not have a good index giving us any kind of information. So what is happening? Now, we all know that over the last 4 years, corruption probably went up in Washington, D.C. We all know that. I mean, if you look at the most commonly used definition of corruption using public office for private gain, it describes what's happening in the White House today, all right? But to me, more interesting question is not the corruption at the national level in the US, but the corruption in individual states. We have 50 states here, and they are significantly different from each other, economically, demographically, politically. Yet they live under the same federal umbrella, but the level of corruption also changes significantly from one state to another. We have several indices measuring corruption going back to 4 or 5 decades at the state level. And we see a major discrepancy among different groups of states. And for example, we have, say, Illinois, New Jersey, Louisiana. These states appear to be the most corrupt states, whatever measure you use. But if you look at 40 years ago, these three are, again, the most corrupt states. So what we see here is the stickiness of corruption. So once you become corrupt, you stay corrupt for a very, very long time. when it comes to individual states, I think we also need to look at the type of corruption that the states are suffering from. Now, there's Michael Johnston and I, we've been studying different forms of corruption in individual states. And there's a new literature developing on the issue of legal corruption. So if we define illegal corruption as the use of office for private gain, we can define legal corruption as the use of office for political gain. And legal corruption is becoming an even bigger problem in the United States today. And it's because of our very relaxed campaign finance laws. So it's pretty much all about money in politics. And so over the last 5 years, we've been surveying political reporters in each state to measure these two forms of corruption. And for us, the most interesting question was, are these complementary or are these substitutes? Because economists tend to classify illegal corruption as breaking the rules and legal corruption as bending the rules. And economists tend to assume these two substitute each other. But using the index that we constructed over the 5 years, we actually found that these two complement each other. So if one of them goes up, the other one goes up as well. And the direction of causality, there's a bi-directional relationship. It runs from both ways. I'll give you an outrageous example of how what legal corruption is and the significance of it in today's politics in the United States. You probably all know who Sacha Baron Cohen is, also known as Borat. He had a show in the US a couple of years ago. The name of the show was Who is America? In one of the episodes, he had a segment called Kinderguardians. He is pretending to be an Israeli anti-terrorism expert. And he has a program training 4-year-olds how to shoot a gun to protect themselves against school shootings in America. So he's promoting this idea. He's talking about his program with 2 sitting US congressmen, one from South Carolina and one from California. And and then he talks about his program. These 2 congressmen enthusiastically endorse his program. One of them says, I'm quoting him, training school children how to shoot might actually make us safer. The other one says, a 3-year-old cannot defend itself from an assault rifle by throwing a Hello Kitty pencil case at it. Our founding fathers do not put an age limit on the Second Amendment. Now, we have 2 possibilities here. One, these 2 congressmen are clinically insane. 2, they are legally corrupt, right? Their political campaigns receive donations from National Rifle Association, and we all know that National Rifle Association is funded by the gun industry today. And this is an extreme example. There's actually a gun lobbyist, and Cohen interviews him too, and the gun lobbyist says, I think it would be a good idea. I've been pushing something along this line for years, but really haven't got any traction. So this is what's happening in the United States today. From gun laws, from gun industry to the pharmaceutical industry. And it is getting out of control. When you look at corruption in the United States at the national level, at the federal level in Washington, D.C., you really do not have a lot of illegal corruption because we'll probably talk about this later in the panel, but because there are a lot of watchdogs. Press is watching them like crazy, right? When it comes to legal corruption, we still have some monitoring happening at the federal level. But you go to states, you go to cities, people get away with murder, literally. And I'll probably stop here and then leave it to the other panelists, see what they have to say, and I'll probably chime in after that.
Thanks, Oz. I guess, Gary, we might come to you next, as I know you're a fan of some older US presidents, so you might be able to offer us a perspective on how things have evolved in the US over a longer time period.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I was very interested to hear what Oz said, and I agree with pretty much all of it. So for decades, I've been with some of my colleagues working on lobbying regulation. We were keen to compare and contrast how lobbying regulations worked across the globe. And historically, the United States, lobbying exists because the First Amendment basically allows it to exist with its redress of grievance. If you can have redress of grievance, as it states in the First Amendment, then anybody can lobby the federal government, state governments, city governments to redress what they see as a grievance. And historically, this came to the fore after the American Civil War. So from 1865 right up to about 1900. When the railroads were built all across the United States, this spawned humongous amounts of corruption, basically because those building the railroads paid those officials who had the wherewithal, or who had the levers of giving contracts, and that spawned a huge crisis in the United States. And at the turn of the century, you mentioned when we discussed doing this session about the muckraking press, that's very important, I think, in the first decade of the 20th century. And Tanya maybe can talk about this now in terms of the modern press. But a lot of the naked corruption in the railroad industry, but also in things like licensing for meat packers. There's a famous study in Chicago. Gabriel Kolko wrote about this, 4 or 5 decades ago. And there was a reaction to this in the press, and the first lobbying laws in federally in the United States, they started to think about them at that particular time. But it wasn't until 1945 that we do get the first federal lobbying law. It's very, very brief, 4 pages long only. And it was mainly to do with stopping foreign agents in terms of the Second World War, influencing the federal government. What I would say is that while the United States is the home of the lobbyist, it's also the home of the regulator. But what's happened, I think, over the course of the past decade in particular, so we have this book, I'll give it a little plug, Regulating Lobbying, second edition. But in the first edition, which was written back in 2010, so 10 years ago, we have about 9 years between the 2 editions. I think what's happened in the course of the intervening decade is that the regulations have been watered down significantly at the state level. I think Oz's point about the state is very well made. We did a study on Washington State for our first edition, very powerful Public Disclosures Commission, and that was gutted over the course of the last decade under Republican administrations, where they simply stopped funding it to any great extent. I mean, to go to your the kernel of your main question, is the United States corrupt? I mean, in one way, the way I would answer that is I think it facilitates corruption through the First Amendment. It tries to counter it through the lobbying laws it has. But the fundamental point seems to be that unless you actually enforce the regulations you have, then the corruption becomes more pronounced. I think the sums involved also. I mean, I was touched on this, but we're now looking at the current presidential election. They reckon will go to $11 billion will be spent by both camps. So it's just a sheer amount of money needed to be raised in fundraisers through PACs. It just I think it leaves open that possibility for corruption. And just on guns, just to finish my own contribution here, and Oz's point on guns, but I mean, the gun lobby, although extremely important and influential, it's not even in the top 6 or 7 when it comes to those who spend the most money. I mean, I'll read them out. Pharmaceuticals are number 1, insurance is 2, electric utilities 3, electronic and manufacturing, oil and gas. So when we think about guns as, you know, being very influential and the money spent there by the NRA, which is significant, it isn't in the same realm at all as some of these other places. What I will also point to, nursing homes, hospitals, huge amount of lobbying money spent there. And you can see why Republicans want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. And that's been a huge, it's been a huge boon to the lobbying industry, those who would want to see that gone. And finally, telecom services, again, is huge amounts of money spent in lobbying in telecom over the course of the past decades. Well, we're talking about billions, literally, here. So that's where I would, these are my sort of opening remarks, if they help.
Thanks, Gary. It's all very interesting, of course. And you set up Tanya well, I think, for the question, because you mentioned the kind of the muckraking journalists of Teddy Roosevelt's era and the role they played in kind of driving some social change. And that's been something that's been a research agenda for us in ARC, to kind of run down the idea that press freedom is an important part of the anti-corruption immune system. I guess, Tanya, it might be most appropriate to ask you a question like this. You know, do you think that either the old press or the new media are fulfilling that role in the US? And if not, you know, what can we do to kind of get rid of the fake news and bring back the real news?
Yeah, I mean, I am very much a media scholar, and I think there are certain points that both Oz and Gary have mentioned that I'd like to draw on and maybe bring together. I agree very much that obviously the role of the media here, which in the US have traditionally been seen, mainstream media, as gatekeepers and agenda setters, right? So that role was quite important for exposing corruption and actually pointing to it as something that was worth investigating or was worth looking at closer. And I think that role has, according to even some of the mainstream media outlets themselves, has kind of moved to the background a little bit, right? Because obviously the news cycle has changed drastically, and new media and social media have played a huge role in that. So I think at a certain point, it's become really difficult to know what exactly is worth focusing on, right? Is it the shootings in the schools? Is it, you know, or is it the lobbying of the gun regulations? And I think the news cycle has become so fast that very often people don't even have time to focus on the fact, you know, well, if we want to talk about school shootings and why they happen or why they don't happen, and how that is connected to gun regulations and how those connect to the fact that the gun lobby is strong, but it's also not the strongest. On the other hand, right, we have a healthcare system, which again, right, are we talking about the crisis in the healthcare system, or are we talking about who is lobbying for, you know, removing the Affordable Care Act? You could keep on going here, but I think it's very important to point to the media not only as gatekeepers and to see that, you know, perhaps they have now noticed that their role has been undermined by both the news cycle and, you know, the social media, where everybody is an agenda setter. And very often you really don't know whose story or whose posts will go viral. And it's very easy to push things off the agenda and very hard to put them back on. So I think mainstream media have really are now reckoning with that. And I think they're trying to some extent to regain that gatekeeping role. There was a really good piece by Ben Smith in the New York Times just yesterday that talks about this exact thing, right? That mainstream media should be trying to reclaim their role as gatekeepers. Because I think, again, speaking as a media scholar, to me, the question of, is America a corrupt country? It's also important to talk about perceptions, right? Is America or the United States perceived as a corrupt country? And obviously, perceptions are very much influenced by what is on the agenda and how it's framed, right? And I think it's really interesting, again, to go back to Gera's point about the fact that lobbying is such an institution, and the way campaign financing works as such an institution. It's been around for years and years, and it's become so normalized that it's not actually seen by many people as an issue. They in fact, they're proud. They say, well, this is legal in America, right? Like funding particular political forces is legal, whereas in a lot of other countries, it does not work the same way at all. And it's actually kind of frowned upon when these transactional relationships exist in such an open way. And so those transactions have to be conducted kind of behind the scenes. So I think it's really interesting to also talk about whether the perception of the US as a corrupt country, or certain parts of the executive, or certain officials as corrupt, has changed, and what influenced those changes. And here I'd like to go back to Oz's point about corruption at state level and at local level. And I think in many ways, the fact that there is in fact more corruption, and it's much more brazen at state and local level, is undoubtedly for me connected to the demise of the local press in the US, because this is an institution that has seen tremendous trouble. We have lost so many local and regional newspapers, TV stations. They've all been merged, swallowed. They just have stopped existing. And I think that has borne its fruit because, again, it's just so much easier to get away with things when nobody's shining a light on what is happening in your town, right? And so we've seen things like the Flint water crisis, other examples that are probably countless, but I think that is very much connected. And I think, bringing in social media here, I don't at all think that they're some kind of panacea, or that they will resolve things, because on the one hand, they are an open public sphere where anybody can publish anything, and no matter how hard social media platforms try to police misinformation or try to police fake news. Even publishing real news, it doesn't guarantee that it will be visible, or that it won't be framed in some perverse way and actually flouted as a success as opposed to an issue. So on the other hand, don't forget that social media platforms are run by corporations who are also in the lobbying business, and who are also lobbying for their interests. And their prime interest is obviously turning a profit. So they are very much worried not only about freedom of speech, but also about remaining afloat. So, all social media corporations are also donating to PACs left and right. And, they're visiting, I think, in fact, today, they're visiting Congress again to talk about, how and what they're doing and what they see their role as. But I think, yes, I think that there's not necessarily an optimistic outlook on the fact that social media as this kind of horizontal playing ground will help retain some kind of transparency, or retain some kind of space where corruption can become more visible. But if it isn't framed as an issue, I don't think that's going to be very helpful.
Great, thanks, Tanya. It's all really fascinating. I mean, as you say, that looking for panaceas in anti-corruption work is a fool's errand. We'll never find something that will, no magic bullet. But we're always looking for something that have a little bit of marginal improvement. Maybe I'll also put the question to you, as you mentioned earlier on. You've been trying to measure corruption based on these local newspapers and local reporters. What do you think do you concur with Tanya's point about the role of the local media as being particularly important?
Oh yeah, and one of the results we found was so we also asked reporters how well corruption is covered in their state by the media, and we found that voter participation reduces corruption only if corruption is covered well enough. If the media coverage is not well, actually voter participation increases corruption. That means if the media doesn't cover corruption, corrupt officials, because they have more resources to fund their campaigns, they can actually win an election over and over and over. And what I noticed when I was conducting the survey over the last 5 years, the number of reporters covering the state houses in each state, it's going down continuously. I track down these reporters by looking at their Twitter pages and everything. I mean, I noticed one prominent political reporter, she became a real estate agent in Florida because the local press is shrinking, they're firing people, and people need to make their livings, right? And so in some states, they don't have full-time reporters covering state houses in some smaller states. You still have decent number of people covering California State House, New York State House, because these are major states, right? But if you go to states like Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, if you're lucky, you will find 1 or 2 people covering, or if you're not lucky, there's nobody covering, a couple of interns maybe, right? And if you leave these politicians alone, they're like leaving a kid in a candy store, right? Unsupervised. And I'll give you an example how important local media is. This happened 2 years ago in Alabama. A Republican senator introduced a bill sponsored by the pro tempore state Senate president. This is what the bill proposed: lift restrictions on gifts to public officials from lobbyists and the people who hire them, make bribes less than $6,000 and stealing less than $5,000 from the local and state government a misdemeanor, not a felony, redefine nepotism to cover only spouses and children under 18, take corruption cases away from the Ethics Commission and the Attorney General, and give them to the local district attorneys who don't have any resources to prosecute these cases. Local media attacked this bill viciously, and thanks to local media, this bill stopped. They were going to pass this. They were going to make bribery a misdemeanor. Right? This is how important media is. But there's also another trend here. The media is being consolidated in a few hands. We saw, say, what happened in Washington Post after Bezos took over. Washington Post was known to be a Republican newspaper. Change of ownership, it became almost more liberal than New York Times, right? And in local media sources, so you do observe these things at the national level more, but at the local level, there are 2 or 3 major corporations owning all these local outlets. And this is becoming dangerous to me, in my opinion. And I would like to add one more thing about this lobbying and legal corruption. When we define legal corruption, I mean, we were not the first ones defining it. There's Kaufman had a definition, Dennis Thompson had a definition. We put it in a more formal way and then tried to measure it. Even some political scientists, the reactions we got by, hey, this is what politics is. No, it is not what politics is, right? This Texas reporter, we also asked reporters to comment on the survey. This is the comment he left. He says, illegal corruption is easy. You find someone handing out an envelope of cash, he goes to prison. Legal corruption is more difficult. If you give someone campaign cash because he represents your views, that is the system. This is the system. Okay. But if you give the same cash so that he will represent your views, this is legal corruption. So people need to understand the difference between the two. This is what we are after, but this is what we call legal corruption. And this is not what politics is. At least this is not what politics should be. If you perceive politics as this, then we are all doomed, really.
Could I make one point,
Yeah.
Rob? I just basically to back up Oz. There's a very famous case from Washington State, which I'll relate now, but it goes to the idea of having the structures in place to penalize corruption or malfeasance. So there was a case in 2011 of a county commissioner in in Seattle, and a small town outside Seattle, and his plan for campaign re-election. That was in 2011. The investigation wasn't finished until 2016. He was found guilty and fined the maximum amount, which was $4,200. And in the meantime, he had been re-elected not once but twice. And that is the problem. That is the difficulty. So it's very easy in one way for politicians to control the regulators if they don't basically give them the teeth or the powers to enforce the existing legislation. And what happens then, of course, is the legislation becomes watered down, and then the public gets sick about it. So there was this big outcry in 2011, and then by 2016, everybody had forgotten about it. In fact, by 2014, everyone had forgotten about it, and this chap got re-elected twice, as I say. So you can see the difficulties. I've always thought. I mean, we did some work for the Irish government, my lobbying regulation colleagues and myself. And one of the things we were very strong on was that if you're going to have significant lobbying legislation, you have to have it backed up with teeth. And even at that stage, those we were talking to were very reluctant to have this teeth being anyway sharp. Sorry for using that terrible analogy, but I think it gets to the point of what we're at, and we saw it here a few weeks ago in the Michael Darcy case, where he went off to the pensions or the I can't remember the name of it, but basically the corporation that he was responsible for when he was in the Office for Public Works. And now that's a different thing in one way, but I think if you don't have significant regulatory powers, the opportunity for corruption just grows and grows.
This there's also, you cannot really solve the problem with law enforcement only. I mean, there should be a more concerted effort coming from the industry, coming from the voters, coming from the government officials. It has to be a concerted effort. I'll give you an example.
Well, I agree with that. I agree.
Yeah. So this is a very prominent lobbyist in Maryland, in Baltimore. He cooked up a scheme with a state legislator, and they extorted money from paint companies. They got caught. They got both convicted. And when this lobbyist was serving his term, the remainder of his term, in a halfway house, this is happening in the 1990s, using a payphone, he started lobbying again and made a record revenue that year. So everybody knew this guy extorted money from his clients, but he was able to find new clients from a halfway house. And this is what actually surprised the prosecutors who prosecuted the case the most. He says, look, we convicted this guy. He went to prison, and this is what's happening today. So I think, one of the probably questions that we were going to talk about is like how to fight with corruption, with, what should the law enforcement do and all that stuff. To me, law enforcement can do only so much. If we don't demand to clean up the system, it will never be clean. I'll give you another example. Rod Blagojevich, he was one of our former governors in Illinois. He got caught trying to sell President Obama's Senate seat. FBI was listening to him. They went to trial. In his first trial, he was convicted. He was found guilty on only one count, lying to FBI. He was not found guilty on corruption. There was one juror. She was not convinced. So it is extremely difficult to convict someone, right? The easiest way to get rid of a corrupt politician is to vote him out. But the same Rod Blagojevich, he got caught in his second term. In his first term, everybody knew he was corrupt. He was running for re-election. The voter participation in Illinois was less than 50%. Half of the population didn't bother voting. He got reelected. Well, you were a corrupt guy, and people keep electing you. So what are you going to do? Of course, I will keep stealing because they're okay with it, right? I think I talk too much.
That's basically how politics works in Ukraine. It's like if you know, if people keep electing you, of course you're going to keep stealing. There's no question about it. But I mean, and yeah, I mean, so I've done some work on Ukraine because that's my country of birth. But it's really interesting to me to kind of watch what's happening in the US and to try to examine it from the point of view of, you know, people who are, for instance, are journalists who are used to reporting on corruption, say in Ukraine, where they're like, well, here, we'll share all our case studies with you. Look at everything that's happened in Ukraine, where people have been, you know, in politics for generations, and now their children are going into politics, and everybody knows they're corrupt. But people's argument is, well, there's nobody else to vote for because they keep running. You know, they're still afloat. Nobody's being prosecuted for anything because our judiciary is also corrupt, which is another important matter, I think, to add to all of this systemic approach that both Gary and Oz have described. Is that, you know, it's really important that if you want to eradicate corruption, all of the elements in your system should be working in concert. And if a single element is rotten, or if more than one element is rotten, it's just not going to work. You know, so I mean, in Ukraine, I think the difference in comparison with the US is that there are really no, people don't make a career in a single party. In fact, it's quite the opposite, because there are no real political parties with agendas in Ukraine. People just jump between parties. So a particular politician can have, you know, three or four different parties that he's been a member of, and he just keeps running because he doesn't care which party he runs on, because his agenda is to get rich, and that's the program that they're running on. And I think, like, to me, it's really interesting to see that. I think, and you know, maybe Gary and Oz can correct me on this, but it's really interesting that we now also see American politicians kind of openly admitting that, you know, or at least somewhat openly admitting that, like, that's why they want to go into politics. That it's not a secret that people go into politics because they see this as an opportunity to enrich themselves and to use their public office for political gains. Like, that's par for the course, so to speak. And it's interesting to ask them the question, is this going to become normalized in the US to the same extent that it's normalized in countries that we typically think of as corrupt countries, you know, Ukraine being a prime example?
One thing I noticed in the US is, you know, when we talk about concerted effort fighting with corruption, especially, you know, it should come from the bottom, right? The people should demand it. And so why wouldn't people demand a clean system? I mean, they do, and you ask them, you say, oh yeah, this is corrupt, it's bad, right? But the problem in US, when you apply for a passport, you don't have to pay a bribe. You get your passport, right? So petty corruption, the corruption that you have to deal with in your daily lives, it doesn't exist that much. So people don't see corruption as a big problem. It is a big problem because it affects economic growth in the long term. It affects your long-term incomes. It affects your long-term quality of life. But you don't have to pay a bribe to get a simple license, to get a passport, so on and so forth. It's not. So if you talk to a Turkish guy or a Nigerian guy versus someone from Texas, the responses you get are completely different, right? Because the type of corruption they deal with are different. So that's one thing that I think lacking in the US, because we don't have enough petty corruption. People don't see corruption as a big problem.
Right, because it's not routine.
Yeah. We should actually convince some traffic cops to start extorting money from people, so we can actually say that, hey, corruption is a problem here, right?
I'll run that one past the DCU ethics board. We'll see if we can get that study.
It's going to be an experiment. No, but I mean, I agree. I think corruption is so normalized in these other countries that we've kind of listed as examples, that it's a problem, but at the same time, it's also a part of life, and people understand, what corruption means. Whereas if the extent of corruption in a country is, it's all kind of up there at very high levels, and most of it is in offshores and hidden bank accounts, and it's never visible, then exactly, people are not going to think it's an issue because it never really touches their lives directly, or they don't see how it touches their lives. And that's why, again, I think it's so important to do the work that journalists do, and especially increasingly to see that this work of investigative journalism around all of these corrupt schemes is being done across border. It's being done by huge collaborative teams which are working on open source intelligence and huge data leaks. So projects like the Panama Papers, the FinCEN files, all of that. It becomes so important because that is really the only way you can show the scale. But you need to show the scale by saying, here's how much has been laundered. But then you have to go down to national and local level, and you have to get national and local journalists to tell the stories that matter to their audiences. Otherwise, it's never going to become a thing for those countries if they don't see exactly how a particular scheme is impacting their lives.
So I might use that. Sorry, Gary, go ahead.
No, just one very small point in terms of the why the citizens don't see the corruption or whatever. I think one of the issues is, of course, citizens have very good access to their representatives in the states. Very good access, as good as anywhere else in the world. So, in one way, while lobbyists pay vast amounts of money, and lobbyists are paid vast amounts of money by people to gain access to lawmakers and decision makers, normal citizens have this access themselves quite easily. Now you might have to ring up in advance or whatever, but you can get to see your local congressman it's not that difficult to do. And no matter, it could be a broken traffic light or whatever. And I think this is part of the thought process of why people don't see any potential corruption, because they do have this good access to their legislators.
So my segue got away from me. Tanya was talking about how some people can normalize the corruption. I wanted to maybe use that as a jumping off point to get to something else we've all become sadly normalized to, which is the coronavirus crisis that's ongoing and probably will be for some time. And I think it's important to tie together kind of big global issues, which corruption is one. So I might put it to Oz first. Do you think that the US response to coronavirus has been undermined by corruption in any way? And if so, what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely, actually, there's a recent paper available online, written by Rob Gillanders and myself. We looked at the effects of corruption on social distancing at the state level, and our thought mechanism was, all right, so if there is corruption, corruption is going to lower the trust in government. If trust in government goes down, legitimacy of government goes down. So when people look at government policies, which includes public health policies, they're not going to really listen to it. And we found that in more corrupt states, people really don't care about social distancing that much. They don't follow the stay-at-home orders. And after we wrote that paper, I had access to mask data, what percentage of people are wearing masks. And I looked at simple correlations between corruption and mask wearing behavior. I found the same relationship. If corruption goes up in a state, people don't wear masks. And remember, when we do this, we are controlling for political ideology and all these other factors. So corruption has a distinct effect on social distancing behavior and or COVID prevention behavior, so we call it. So anytime you introduce a policy, you have to have legitimacy. If the state is perceived to be corrupt, or if the state government is corrupt, that corrupt government is not going to have legitimacy. So that policy has no chance of being successful. That was our starting point, and that's what we found. And now we are actually paying the price of it here. I mean, cases are spiking up everywhere. It's spiking up, but now, yeah, it's and the trust in government is continuously going down every day.
Hello, may I ask a question or put in some?
Well, I think we're just holding questions until the end, I think, unless it's a particularly pressing one. So if you put it into the chat, we might just get to that at the end, because I think it's important that Tanya comes in there, because what I did abuse my own power to ask a question about my own research, and I hope you'll all forgive me for that bit of corruption. I think it's important that I think social media probably and disinformation might play a role in the story that Oz just told. So it'd be interesting hearing Tanya's thoughts on that.
I think to some extent, and obviously, there is also, just as there is a relationship between the level of corruption and perception of corruption and trust, again, right, it also shapes, I think, to some extent, how people interpret what they see when they read the media or when they go on social media, and how they make conclusions about what a particular news story or a particular decision means, right? So I think it's been really interesting to see, again, how people, based on how much they trust what their governments or state governments tell them, how they interpret particular norms or particular requirements that are issued by the CDC or by their local authorities. So that's been one thing. But I think the other thing has been really interesting to see, again, how people respond to, for instance, decisions that are made about deciding to fund development of particular vaccines, or deciding to direct state or federal funding to the purchase of particular medical equipment or particular medicines, depending, again, right, seemingly on scientific advice. But once journalists start to dig deeper, it turns out that it's not often based on scientific advice. And in fact, it's actually often based on, shares in a particular pharma company, or because somebody, who runs a particular company or has told a state official or a federal official that, this one is going to work for sure. So I think, again, there's a lot of opportunities here for undermining trust, because these decisions are made, and there's a lot of public relations happening around every such decision when it's made, whether it's remdesivir or a particular vaccine manufacturer who gets the rights. But I think, right, there's a difference between making this decision because you might profit from it, or you might get a reputation boost from making this decision, and actually making this decision because it's based on sound public advice, right? So social media have a part, but it's, again, I think social media are largely, and what happens on social media, it's largely framed by and boosted by voices who are influential, right? And that will, of course, depend on, your political preference, but also your interpretive preference. Who do you trust to interpret the news, right? And again, that might differ depending where you are on the political spectrum or which state you're based in.
And that's actually another, you keep setting me up with good segues, and I'm going to pounce on this one before it gets away from me, because I think we might move on to questions from the audience, because they've been coming in, and you kind of speaking about who you trust and who interprets it. We've one question here, which I'll put to you first, Tanya, and other people can jump in as they see. And it's from Ian McMenamin. What role, if any, has increasing polarization played in the increase in corruption in the US? But I guess there's a more general point about what is the polarization doing to the kind of political economy or political processes in the US?
I mean, I think it's interesting because there is this, for a while, there was this very persistent narrative in political communication research, and especially political communication research about social media and their role, that they increase political polarization. But there's actually a more recent, and I think really interesting paper that doesn't look at the US, but it looks at Israel and a few other countries. But what it argues is that what happens on social media doesn't so much increase political polarization as it increases interpretive polarization. So people don't necessarily change their political views, or they become more entrenched in their political views, but rather they change how they interpret specific events, be that a huge rise in coronavirus cases, or poll results, what the predicted outcome of the election might be, or when we have headlines about the commander-in-chief profiting from people using Mar-a-Lago and his other properties, and the fact that he was even charging for bottled water or glasses of water. So to me, I think that seems to be a more reasonable understanding of the role that social media platforms are playing, again, because their role is increasingly not just about inciting certain far right or far left views, but it's putting specific spins and specific interpretations on how certain news or certain decisions or certain revelations are interpreted and what they mean. And I think that's where we might actually be facing a more grave danger, because, right, so misinformation is not only that information that spreads false information and news, but it's also that which misrepresents what they mean. And I think that's much more pernicious and much harder to fight.
Could I just come in on Ian's question, Rob? I think the polarization and the sort of the tightening in one way of the support that both parties has if anything increased the number of dollars being spent. Because pharmaceutical companies, if you look at the virus, for instance, are electronic companies. We saw Oz talk about Jeff Bezos, whatever. So they're spending more money on either party because they're basically hedging their bets as distinct who might get elected or not, both at state level, congressional level, and at the federal level. And while the numbers are astonishing, as I said, 11 billion at the federal level, the money also being spent at local congressional level is astonishing as well. And that's coming basically, it's being funded by the polarization, I think. So
there's another issue here. I think the more polarized the society is, the people become, they start acting like soccer fans. So I'm a rabid Fenerbahce fan, a big football club in Turkey. And when Fenerbahce loses, I never blame my team. I always blame the ref. This is the definition of a typical football fan, right? So if you look at the highly polarized, politicized supporters of each party, and if you ask where corruption is in terms of importance in their list of preferences, it's in the very bottom. So people don't really see their parties as corrupt. If their parties do something, or the politicians they support do something, they always find an excuse to defend it. A typical behavior of a football fan, right? So I think, we need to talk to a psychologist who investigate these football fans and and we can actually get some clues maybe, right?
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because, again, it becomes more about personal, it becomes about you voting for a particular person because they're a nice guy and, they're always friendly and they always shake my hand or whatever, hopefully having washed it beforehand. But it becomes less about what it is that they're actually doing and what it is that they're actually profiting from. But, I'm voting for them because I've always voted for them and because they're a nice guy. And it doesn't really matter what they do or what their political program is. I'm just going to keep voting for them. And if that makes me, more polarized, then so be it. But I mean, essentially, that's where we're heading.
Thanks. We have a couple of minutes left. I'll just try and squeeze in two paired questions for relatively quick answers. There was a question about why, while the US is such a great leader in prosecuting foreign bribery with the FCPA, Why is there less of an appetite to combat domestic corruption? And also, can you think of any of the, from your own your own knowledge, are there any particularly egregious examples of how donations and lobbying have changed U.S. foreign policy decisions? So the kind of that nexus of foreign corruption and domestic politics and domestic corruption. I might go to Oz first.
Thank you. I don't know any specific case when it comes to U.S. companies, bribing government officials outside of the U.S. But I have, so I think they introduced that law not because they want to protect other countries. They introduced that law because it is a race to the bottom among American companies. Once you start bribing a, say, Korean government official to get a contract, another American company has to bribe him more to get the contract. So this is a race to the bottom, and I think that was a smart move for the American government to introduce that law. And does that law cripple American firms? Unfortunately, it does. I had a chance to talk to a higher-up administrator in Caterpillar. And I asked him, how does this law affect you guys getting contracts outside in the world? And he says it is almost impossible to compete with the Koreans and the Chinese. So when CAT goes into bidding together, competing against the Chinese and a Korean company, because of this law, they are tied, their hands are tied. They cannot bribe anybody. And in a lot of the countries in the world, if you don't bribe anybody, you won't get a government contract. So, and like I said, I know one big case which happened in 1970s in Turkey. American government, I'm Turkish, so I know a lot about Turkish corruption. American government actually, it was Lockheed, one of the biggest companies in the world and in the US. Lockheed was bribing everybody in the world to sell their fighter jets. And American company gave all the information to the Turkish government to prosecute the corrupt Turkish officials and the Lockheed officials, and the Turkish government buried it. They did not do anything. So, I mean, that's the biggest case I know about, this Foreign Act and all that stuff. But please tell me if you know more.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave you with the last words on that, Oz. We're just about out of time. I know there were questions we didn't get to, and I apologize for that. It's obviously a very stimulating, thought-provoking panel, and thank all three of you for joining us and sharing your expertise. Hopefully, there'll be occasion to have a follow-up event on corruption in the US, but we'll have to see, I guess, how things go next week. So without further ado, I will thank you very much for your time and wish you all the best for the times ahead. Thanks.